What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Cricket Icon 4 and the Motorola Moto G Pure. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about each of them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Cricket Icon 4, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. With the Moto G Pure, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display as well, with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio as well. So in general, as you can see, these displays are pretty much the exact same, so honestly, you're really not going to see a significant difference between the two. That being said, if you're doing more light, basic content consumption, like watching the occasional video every now and then, and maybe reading, browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, while these displays of course are not going to be nearly as good as a much higher end phone, for what they are, they definitely will get the job done. Now both phones are getting 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so in general this is really not a lot of storage. So if you're constantly downloading apps, especially stuff like games that tend to take up more space, you're definitely going to want to spend a little bit more and get a higher end phone that has more storage. But in general, just keep in mind, phones in this price range usually don't have a lot of storage, so even though 32GB in my opinion really is not going to be enough for the average user, for this price range, having a small amount of storage like this is pretty normal. Now for security features, both phones do have face unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners right here on the back. So starting with the Cricket Icon 4, let's give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the Moto G Pure. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners did work pretty well, no issues at all. And again, both phones do have face unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now for the cameras, both phones have pretty much identical water drop notches for the front facing cameras. These cameras are both 5 megapixels. And for the rear cameras, both phones have 13 megapixel main cameras, but the difference here is, with the Moto G Pure, we are also getting a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, whereas the Cricket Icon 4 only has the one single camera. So in general, when it comes to features, these phones are pretty much equally featureless. There's really not going to be a whole lot here. Unfortunately, neither phone has an ultra-wide camera or a macro camera, but that being said, for lower end phones like these, this is pretty normal. When it comes to quality, I would say in general, the Moto G Pure is a little bit better. Sure, on one hand, even this phone is not going to be nearly as good as a mid-range phone, for example, and if you're taking a lot of photos, you're probably going to want to spend a bit more and get a phone that has a better camera in general. But that being said, again, between the two, you can at least get decently usable photos with the Moto G Pure. So if you want to get a couple nice photos, maybe for social media, for example, this phone will at least get the job done, whereas with the Cricket Icon 4, the quality is definitely quite a bit more questionable. And since this phone doesn't have a depth sensing camera, although technically it does have portrait mode, it's not going to work nearly as well as it does with the Moto G Pure. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Cricket Icon 4, we're getting 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. With the Moto G Pure, this phone also has 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G25. Now in general, when it comes to overall performance, you're not really going to see a significant performance difference between the two. I mean, both are pretty slow phones, and being really low-end entry-level phones, they are really only meant for light use and really basic activities. That being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both phones, and here are the scores I got. So as you can see, the Cricket Icon 4 did do a little bit better, but in my experience, again, you're really not going to see a significant performance difference between the two, and honestly, when you're getting a phone like this, you can't really expect to have good performance anyway. So in general, if you're really a light user, and you're not doing a whole lot with your phone, then these phones will at least get the job done for more basic activities. But if you're going to be on your phone a lot, then I would definitely recommend getting a slightly higher end device that has a faster processor. Now when it comes to the battery, these phones are actually the exact same, both having 4000 mAh batteries that support 10-watt fast charging. So with these phones, you can expect to get pretty good battery life here. Sure, they're not quite 5000 mAh batteries, so if you really want the best battery life you can get, you can still do better. But for entry-level phones like these, a lot of the time, really low-end phones tend to have slightly smaller batteries. So for what they are, I do think the batteries we're getting with these phones are pretty good. Another thing to keep in mind here is that with the Cricket Icon 4, we are actually getting Android 12, whereas the Moto G Pure only has Android 11. On one hand, since we are on Android 13, and neither phone is going to be getting any major updates, if you want the actual latest version of Android, then you are still probably going to be disappointed here. But that being said, if you're not too concerned with having the absolute latest version, but you want something at least decently newer, then again, keep in mind, the Cricket Icon 4 does actually have Android 12, which is definitely pretty good for what it is, whereas the Moto G Pure does only have Android 11. In addition to this, surprisingly, the Cricket Icon 4 actually does have NFC, so if you want to use tap and pay, you can with this phone. And honestly, this is probably the cheapest phone I've seen that actually has this feature. But on the other hand, the Moto G Pure does not have NFC, so between the two, if you do want to use tap and pay, the Cricket Icon 4 will be the way to go. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in most ways, these phones are pretty much completely the same. You're not really going to see any differences in performance, the display, the storage, or the battery. But that being said, each phone does have an advantage over the other. On one hand, with the Cricket Icon 4, this phone does have NFC, so if you like to use contactless mobile payment services, I imagine this will be a pretty big deal. But on the other hand, again, I do think the Moto G Pure does have a better camera, so if you're taking more photos, then this is definitely something to keep in mind as well. But aside from that, if you're looking for a really affordable entry-level phone for more basic activities, you don't need a fancy camera or a super nice display, and in general, you're really just not going to be using your phone a whole lot. For that kind of situation, either phone is going to be perfectly fine. But this concludes my comparison between the Cricket Icon 4 and the Motorola Moto G Pure. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.